Hello. Today we conclude our studies in the book of Judges by looking at the last 3 chapters. So please open your Bibles and perhaps read the passage before you continue. Once again, the chorus line of the final chapters of the book of Judges is heard. In those days, Israel had no king. And in view of what has happened in the previous 2 chapters, the words have an ominous ring. And once again we are introduced to a Levite. This time, however, one who has no aristocratic family ties and who comes from one of the poorer regions of Israel, the hill country of Ephraim. The story, however, apparently begins well. In ancient Israel, as in many places in the modern world, a marriage involved the payment of a sum of money to the groom's family by the girl's parents. This was understood to provide support to a family group who now had an extra mouth to feed. However, where a family was poor, a girl could be sold as a wife. Thus the family received an income from the girl rather than having to spend beyond its means to find a suitable husband. The Levite had apparently contracted this form of marriage, hence the reference to the girl as his concubine. The girl, however, proved unfaithful, presumably by committing adultery, and then went back home to her father. The Levite resolves after a period of 4 months to persuade her to return to Ephraim. And since the Old Testament law calls for the death penalty for adultery, both the family and the Levite may be regarded as out of step with the Lord's mercy and will. However, the same scriptures do emphasize the Lord's mercy and encourage judgment to be tempered with mercy. So once again, the Levite's action can be seen in the best possible light. The Levite received a warm welcome and lavish oriental hospitality, and the girl seems content to return to the Levite. The reference to her having taken the Levite to her father's house seems a coded message intended to indicate her consent. All seems to be moving towards the scenario that they lived happily ever after. But did we correctly hear an ominous note in the words that in those days Israel had no king? At length the Levite, unwilling to overstay his welcome, or at least we can read his actions in this way, resolves to go back home with his wife, even though it's late in the day when the party finally leaves. At which point the story does begin to take a turn for the worse. And what a worse it's going to be. First of all, we're reminded that the city of Jebus, or Jerusalem as we know it, was still in pagan hands, an alien city. Then we're alerted to the fact that the Levite is fearful about spending a night among possibly hostile strangers, so nearby Gibeah is chosen. A third worrying note is, however, sounded by the note that no one took them home for the night. Hospitality of strangers was no less expected of the people of God under the Old Covenant as under the New, but here is an entire town turning its back on its God-given responsibility. 2 further notes of warning are struck. Hospitality is eventually found in the home of another stranger to the town, an old man from the hill country of Ephraim, who shows pity on one of his own, and who says, "Only don't spend the night in the square." But why? The story builds up so far, is then brought to a sudden and dramatic climax by the author of the book, and in a way that invites comparison with Genesis 19 and the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's possible that some translations soften the text in verse 22. Certainly it could be translated, "And the men of the city, sons of Belial." In other words, the city is utterly pagan, and its male inhabitants, to a man, are Sodomites. "Bring out the man, so that we can have sex with him," they cry. But, and this is the shocking thing, these people, these sons of Belial, are Israelites. Then, just as suddenly, we begin to realize that all that has gone before has not been all that it seems. The old man offers to sacrifice his virgin daughter and even the Levite's concubine to save his skin. Though he comes up with a rationale, "Since this man is my guest, don't do this disgraceful thing." When this suggestion seems to be getting nowhere, the Levite acts and sends out his concubine for the crowd to rape and abuse her. But the real shock comes when in the morning he is so callous. "Get up and let's go," he says. No wonder he is called her master, not her husband. And all this gives pause for reflection. What sort of wife was this girl? Housekeeper? Sex fulfillment object, perhaps? Whom others can abuse just as the Levite had done. Now perhaps we begin to reflect upon the fact that throughout the story the woman has not spoken a word or uttered an opinion, though others have, even the Levite servant. Under the veneer of this compassionate and forgiving man of God, we're alerted to the fact that this man is himself actually corrupt. And if the other religious leaders are like him, then what? The ghoulish sequel provides what at least at first sight seems an appropriate response. The Israelites are morally outraged, and as we shall see, all of them, an unusual note of unity in this book, are roused to act. But in those days Israel had no king. Will their united response show that they stand on higher moral ground? It's easier to think that this passage has little or nothing to say to us. Granted, it has a lot to say to modern society, but little or nothing surely to the church. But in this we make a great mistake. Nearly every verse of judgment in these 3 chapters concerns the people of God and their conduct to one another. There's little interest in the world outside. And the modern analogy might be that it puts us under the microscope, not the world, because we are the New Testament people of God. Throughout these chapters the concern is with the visible testimony of the community of God's people. Certain conduct could be expected, though not approved of, in the world of men, but it's of no place among the people of God. The Israelites were horrified at the stories of mass homosexuality and rape among themselves, and this reflects their conviction that they were called to live the life of God before men, especially in their community life. We only need to remember that Jesus' words in Matthew 5:21 and following to discover how near to home the application of this passage is to us. We can abuse others in the church in the same way, in other ways rather than by physical violence. Paul understood this. Alongside the description of acts described in Judges, sexual immorality, debauchery, drunkenness, orgies, etc., lie sins which in God's sight are just as bad, since they too strike at the heart of the witness of the Lord's people. Hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions. Indeed, it's interesting to note that these sins lie at the centre of Paul's list, bracketed by others in Galatians chapter 5 verses 19 to 21. Yet how often the church's life exhibits precisely such attitudes, and we're content that they remain there. Moreover, too often God's people are oblivious to the fact that not only is the witness of God's people undermined, but the intention of the Lord that church life should be heaven on earth is utterly set aside. Chapter 20, like the previous chapter, appears to begin encouragingly. In response to the report of the horrifying events in Gibeah, all the Israelites, from Dan to Beersheba, a phrase which emphasizes everyone, all turned up. Not only did they turn up, but the unity of their response is stressed by the words, as one man. Even better, they gathered before the Lord, ready for action. The Levite story having been repeated and edited by him to absolve himself from all blame, the people again, as one person, decide on what appears to be an appropriate response. All again appears to be well. Sadly, the Benjamites are unwilling to act against Gibeah and instead prepare for civil war with a crack corps of sling throwers, who, being left-handed, would attack the enemy from a vulnerable angle, and they were ready for action. We begin to fear the consequences, even if Benjamin is generally outnumbered. Nevertheless, the Israelites went up to Bethel and inquired of the Lord. A clear answer is given and battle engaged. But Israel is defeated. Just what is going on? Plans were, however, made for a second battle, and grief having been expressed for those lost, Israel again gathers before the Lord and inquires of him. Again a clear answer is given. But once again Israel is defeated. It's at this point that we begin to wonder whether Israel has itself done something wrong. As with so much of this section of the Judges, we wonder whether things have not been quite what they seem. The sequel suggests that our questions are on track, for Israel returns to Bethel, but this time there are several differences. This time all the people go up, the grief is deeper, and the offering of burnt offerings and fellowship offerings suggest that the people themselves are aware of their own failures. Finally, their question is more hesitant, reflecting a greater desire to know God's will than to impose their own upon him. And perhaps significantly, Phinehas the priest is mentioned as involved on this occasion. All this builds upon the anxiety we perhaps felt when we read of the Levites' somewhat gilded description of the events at Gibeah. It makes us pause and reflect that the Israelite response was precipitate. Benjamin was not invited to the tribal gathering, and the decision taken begins to read more like that of a lynch mob than of justice. Moreover, when the people first inquired of the Lord, it was not to ask what they should do, but how they should do it. Israel, however, seems to have learnt their lesson, and God promises, "Go, for tomorrow I will give them into your hands." Battle is enjoined again. New and shrewder tactics are adopted and described in considerable detail to emphasize what took place. But as the author recognizes, the Lord defeated Benjamin, a defeat which is almost total. A mere 600 men were left as a remnant of what a few hours later had been a tribe of over 26,000 fighting men. Not all that is described in this chapter is to the credit of Israel, as we've seen above. However, the Israelites were rightly horrified when they realized what was happening among them. They resolved upon action, for action so destructive of community life and of its witness had to be dealt with, even if they sinfully mishandled it. Not surprisingly, they found this led to conflict. It invariably does, for the unspiritual will always side with friends rather than the will of God. Confrontation becomes both inevitable and yet necessary. To the credit of Israel, they did not duck or fudge the issue. Discipline is a word that's unpopular in an indisciplined age. And how quickly we ape the world in its attitudes, how easily we too fall into the trap of thinking the church is a club that we've joined, and folk ought to be pleased we have, no matter what. And we treat the church as something for our own convenience. What a different picture is painted in the Bible. The church is the community of the holy God, which he has set apart, and as such all unholiness must be ruthlessly dealt with for his glory. Of course, in dealing with any failure among the people of God, it's so easy to be holier than thou. Yet we fail if we act in such a way to remember that there, but for the grace of God, go we. Moreover, we forget so often that it's a brother or sister who has fallen, and we lack sorrowful compassion. This was in part Israel's sin. Not until they had recognized their own sinfulness and had shed tears over their own shortcomings and that of their brother did they know the Lord's support. A further more negative lesson is that we learn that the Israelites went into the matter content to depend on their own greater strength. They had to learn the lesson that only utter dependence upon the Lord and a sense of complete weakness would avail. It's a lesson we're sometimes slow to grasp. Chapter 21 brings both the present story and the book of Judges to an end, and what a messy end it is. While some might justify Israel's action against Benjamin as just, and argue that the tribe that had become pagan should be treated as one of the godless peoples of the land, it seems more likely that though the Lord gave them the victory, the carnage that followed was over the top. It's easy to crack a nut with a sledgehammer when it comes to discipline. Our righteous anger becomes a sinful overreaction, and in the heat of the moment we resolve upon actions which subsequently bring much grief. This seems to have happened to Israel. Thus calm reflection led to great grief, with the people raising their voices and weeping bitterly. It also led to an acknowledgement of sin witnessed by the presentation of burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Again, to the credit of the Israelites, they did all that they could to put the matter right. We can applaud their wish to heal the breach and admit their mistakes. Too often we act differently. We consider that to admit a mistake is a sign of weakness. We do not show the attitude of the Lord Jesus, who does not quench a smoking flax or break a bruised reed. Discipline is not unaccompanied by a desire for healing. Yet there is something bizarre about this chapter. It was at Mizpah that the understandable but foolish oath was made before the Lord's will had been openly sought by the people. Thus, while they are understandably concerned not to treat their oath lightly, the problem was one which they seem to have brought upon themselves. Then we miss any reference to their seeking the Lord's will as they seek to resolve the situation, and the result is more carnage. This time, as Jabesh Gilead is wiped out, except for those 400 young women who'd never slept with a man, who are culled as wives for the remaining Benjamite men. And similarly, when the shortfall of 200 women is made good by the ruse of the organised kidnapping of some of the young people attending the annual festival of the Lord at Shiloh, it all seems something of a ruse to escape a technicality. It may be that this dance was a recognised occasion in which spouses were sought and won. Fathers could, by a certain stretch of the imagination, argue that they did not give their daughters, but that they were taken. But all this seems special pleading. So what are we intended to make of all this? Technically, as with the incidents described in chapters 17 and 18, the people seem to act according to the letter of the law, but they seem to be far from its spirit. Israel may be acting as one man, but as the final verse of this book reminds us, everyone did as he saw fit. Without godly leadership which sought the Lord, the people are all too often resort to their own devices, even when their motives, as here, seem good. For us too, we need to be reminded that authority in the church is not found in any of its officers, nor in the majority of its members. It's found in King Jesus. He has set before us the way we should live, and we are to listen to him. It's to him that we are to look for guidance and help. We ought to want to know what he thinks. When we humbly look to him, we shall both individually and collectively begin to live like him, to his glory, our blessing, and to the saving of the world, which was Israel's calling and is ours too. Failure to do so, even when we try our best, is only likely to lead to the messy special pleading and resolutions that the present chapter describes. So the book of Judges ends without a king, but the Israelites going home to their God-given inheritance. What a testimony to the Lord's grace. How can this muddle-headed people, who only turn to the Lord as a last resort, and whose understanding of religion and morality is such as is described in these last 5 chapters, still be Israelites, with an inheritance in the land to which to return? Sheer grace is the answer. Not, of course, a grace that can be presumed upon. There have been enough warnings about this in the book of Judges. But grace which seems to triumph over every disaster that God's people can dream up for themselves. And this is the sustained message of the Old Testament, and it's the supreme point of the New. Then God, in the person of his Son, enters a sin-soaked world of helpless and hopeless men and women, and in love sacrifices himself to save that world. Alleluia. Amazing grace.